Good morning. This is our 8th session of the IQI Academy. It's good to see everybody. Our Teach to Learn conversations were focused on appreciation for a system. And all of your conversations and thinking about a system will benefit you if you first review what is required for a system to thrive. And the answers to this question are found in the definition of a system. A system is a network of interdependent components that work together to try to accomplish the aim of the system. So, and again, your work you're doing this week is good work. I appreciate your efforts, and I appreciate you submitting everything in a timely fashion. That's really helpful. It helps me get responses back to you about questions I might have or comments I have. So thanks. And today we'll focus upon your question number 2 responses to your 3 basic questions. 3 basic questions. How will we know that a change is an improvement? And the work we'll do here will also apply to the way that you plan and formulate your PDSA predictions. And even though 2 of you have already submitted your system activity notes, please continue making observations about your involvement in the various types of activity occurring in your organization system. If you have updates to make to them, please feel free to submit those. They're not due until Monday. Today, we'll review the 3 basic questions and some project scope examples, not only project scope examples, but PDSA scope examples. And using the form you've been sent, you review your 3 basic questions and perhaps update them. So please have your 3 basic questions form available. I'm going to break you into pairs for a couple different conversations today, but later the second one will be about your PDSA and your 3 basic questions. So if you could have those available so you can share those with your partner. And then we'll review our 3 basic questions and perhaps update our PDSA plans. So earlier you submitted 3 14-point scoring grids from yourself and 2 coworkers. Please document in a file or on a piece of paper 3 insights you gained from your discussions, and I'll wait for you to do that. I'm going to place you into pairs to share your insights. I'm going to pair up today Andrea and Michael and Ben and Matt. And please share your insights and discuss your observations. When we return, what I'll ask you to do is share an insight from your partner that your discussion brought out that you did not originally record for yourself. And I'm going to give you about 7 minutes to have this conversation. So what did I say? Andrea and Michael, and then Ben and Matt. So I'm going to open up these rooms. I'll give you 7 minutes, and then I'll call you back together. I'll give you a heads up a few minutes before we're ready to come back together. All right, here we go. All right, welcome back. Let's share what we heard from our partner, an observation that we didn't record for ourselves. I'll let Ben and Matt start first. What do you guys want to, what did you notice? Or what's an insight from your partner discussion that you didn't record?
So one of the things that he had written down was, that I didn't have written down was, he noticed that a lot of the other people's answers were based on personal experience. Like he had discussed the other day about one of the people had a bad experience ever since he was started at the company. The other person had really good experiences. So their answers were kind of based on that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. That applies in a lot of different areas, not just how we perceive how we're doing on the 14 points. We can have an experience, and then everything else after that is observed through that lens of that experience. You know, and so if it's a good one or a bad one, it might influence how we perceive things for quite a while after that. So it's good. Ben, what's an observation that you didn't record?
Yeah, Matt had that coworkers at the same level won't necessarily have the same answers because they're interpreting and thinking about those answers in different ways.
Yeah, and that's another good point. A lot of times we ask questions, we think that people are interpreting the questions the same way that we are. And if, especially when we're just asking for like a 1, 2, 3 score, an ABC response, and we don't ask people to comment, it's very easy to misinterpret people's responses. Sometimes people can sort of have the same score even, but have different reasons for providing that score. So it's real important that we understand that, people are going to have different responses to the things we're asking them. And assuming that they're going to have the same response because they're at the same level of the organization is probably not a good assumption, correct? We noticed that. Okay, thanks. Michael and Andrea.
Okay, we kind of had a lot of similar, I guess, insights as well. But one thing that kind of differed was that she was able to find someone with IQI experience and how they were able to provide different views and were easier able to understand, I guess, the assignment and provide, I guess, feedback we talked about that wasn't really on like the same page as the one that she interviewed that wasn't. So I thought that was just interesting.
Yeah, so exposure to certain ideas or concepts is vastly different depending on your experience, and you're going to have a different level of understanding of what we're talking about, or understanding of what leadership's role is in the organization, even especially after going through IQI, since we spend so much time talking about that. Andrea, what's an observation that you hadn't recorded?
Similar to what Matt brought up, Michael had said that he found like personal experience was a factor in the responses, which wasn't something that I had considered beforehand, because we're not necessarily like just talking about like the people and their job function, but like also what they're bringing with them.
Yeah, that's a good, it's really good to notice those things, because that tells us something about when we're running tests, that people brings their experience and their background and their perceptions and their understanding of how things work to the work you're doing. And you can't make an assumption. It's dangerous to make an assumption about what those things are for people. It's much better to ask and inquire rather than just assume that you know something about how they're thinking or why they're thinking the way they do. It's a good lesson. So these are good observations. Thank you for sharing them. I'm going to move on. We're going to discuss a real life example of project scope selection and identifying moves to improve for short cycle PDSAs. One of the primary criteria for project selection during the academy is frequency. In fact, the scoring grid that you've filled out for your project ideas multiplies the frequency score. Everything else is simply added up. So the frequency of activity in a process is important. Why is that? Why should we have frequency be important for us during the academy? This isn't project selection in life, but this is during the academy. Why do we want a higher frequency process?
Just for more exposure?
What do you mean more exposure?
So you're, exposed to the concept more. You'll get it more ingrained in you and how the process goes.
Okay, so you have more exposure to the process. What else? Why else do we want to have a process that cycles through more than once a week or even daily?
I think so. You can like run as many like PDSA cycles as possible and like manipulate as many things as you can and see like what happens.
Exactly. We want to have rapid learning cycles. So there's two ways to do that. One is to have a process that is used on a regular basis, daily, if not not weekly. And also not only have processes run, but also maybe slice the processes into segments that you can actually run and learn from in short cycles. So it might be maybe the entire process isn't run every day, but parts of the process might be. So there's different ways to look at that. And I'm going to go through one example of how we developed short cycle PDSA tests in a real world problem. So the current state in this situation is it's a large diesel, meaning locomotive engine repair facility. There's 5 major work areas, and 3 to 6 people work in each area. And at the time, there were 2 shifts being run. There were 2 buildings. So we have a main building and then a warehouse area. Parts are needed to do work are both known and unknown. So as you're doing repair on some of the diesel engines, sometimes you do a standard rebuild and you know the parts, but other times you run into parts that you didn't realize you're going to need. When a part that is needed is not on hand, people stop work, they walk to the warehouse, they search the shelves for a part, they sign out the part, and then they return to the work area with the part. Some of those parts require a forklift to transport. They can be fairly large. So as I did a study of this activity, what we noticed was at least 35 individuals, different individuals, visit the warehouse at least once a week, and most visit at least daily. Some visit multiple times per day. So each round trip took about 15 minutes. When we estimated the annual total hours consumed in round trips to and from the warehouse, it turned out to be the equivalent of 6 months of a full-time person simply walking back and forth. So it's like we hired someone and said, we're going to pay you to take a walk, and you're going to walk for 6 months, 8 hours a day. And that's the amount of time that was being consumed by these different trips people were taking. Other observations is work stopped when needed parts were not available. And then work was delayed when workers left the work area to go to the warehouse. Other delays occurred during trips to the warehouse for conversations, smoke breaks, and the parts were not always located immediately. Sometimes the part was found in a different location than was represented in the inventory system. Parts sometimes were stored in 2 locations. Sometimes the first location was empty. Inventory is at 0 and the system reported quantities greater than 0. So there's lots of issues that we were running across. We also found that parts were not always signed out. Workers intended to return to sign out a part if the found part fits. Sometimes they didn't know exactly which part they needed. Some of these engines were in the field for 30, 40 years, and it wasn't always obvious, what the part number was that was needed to replace that part. And then a worker neglects to sign out a part. Sign out sheets are processed only once a week. And sometimes ladders and forklifts are not immediately available for part access or part transport. So here's one of the things that we wrote up. We wanted parts to be available without travel, and we want parts to be available when needed. And we said the number of warehouse trips by production workers equals 0. And production delays caused by waiting for parts, 0 minutes. And then, so moves we could make: assign 1 worker from each area to go get warehouse parts, assign a warehouse worker to bring needed parts, and implement a 3-hour parts look-ahead practice. What are you going to need 3 hours from now? Now, yes, this example doesn't include 7 options. However, what we did select was, this is one area that we said, let's assign a warehouse worker to bring needed parts in to our people in the shop. So here's a question. Are we trying to boil the ocean? Is it easy enough just to say, all right, we're going to assign somebody and that's it? Yeah, the quick answer is yes. If we jump straight to hire or assign a warehouse worker to deliver parts. So what must we first do is one of our questions. So we have in mind something. What do we want to do? We have to learn if such a process can actually work. So how do we do that? Well, what must we learn? So here's it's a very basic question and something we skip over when we have this really brilliant idea about here's how things are going to work. We should ask ourselves, can we perform the very first step of such a process? Like go to the beginning and figure out, hey, can we actually do this step if all the other subsequent steps are going to depend on that? However, what's the very first step in the process? So I have to think about this. Well, what's the very first step in the process? And so answering this is how we avoid boiling the ocean, by thinking carefully about the sequences of actions that must happen and then learn about that. So what tool or practice have I asked you to use to help answer a question like this?
Would be the plan portion of PDSA.
Before that, because your planning is you've selected a move already that you're going to test. So how do you determine which move to test? You got 7 ideas on your 3 basic questions, question number 3 answer, but how do you pick which one of those might be the first thing in your process? There's something else that you have. Yeah, your deployment flowchart is something that would tell you or suggest to you a possible move. So for us, the first step to learn would be, can a production worker request a part? So how do we test that? So how could we do that? Well, we asked 3 workers in the areas, show us how you request a part. And we make a prediction that, yes, they can request a part. And that is our first PDSA cycle. So it was interesting. When we did this, we went to 3 areas and we asked them, can you request a part? And we got things like forms that looked like they had been copied about a bazillion times and now they're sideways. They had old part numbers. It was impossible for them to actually request a part in a way that they could communicate it to somebody else. So once we had them, so we had to fix the forms. We fixed the forms and now said, now can you request a part? So once we had a method to request a part, like we looked at the form and we fixed it. Could the warehouse person who's receiving the part understand what's being requested? So that's another test. We hand them the form that a production worker filled out and then said, can you understand what they're asking for? Once we figured that out, they said yes. Now that they have a receipt of a parts request that can be understood, now can they locate the parts? So we said, now you've got this form. Can you go pick the parts that are requested? Can you find them and fill the request? And you know what? Those were 3 PDSA cycles we ran inside of 1 day. So you can do these things fairly rapidly. You can learn something, make an adjustment, learn something else, make an adjustment. So you can follow through the steps of your deployment flowchart fairly quickly if you break it down into slices that are small enough. Now, each one of these steps are critical to be able to actually, if we said we want to implement a warehouse person bringing parts to the floor, each of these steps have to be run smoothly and with high quality. Otherwise, that process is not going to work. And then later on with the requested parts, can we transport them? If we use bins, crates, skids, where do we deliver the parts? Do we have a place to put them? Can we keep those parts free from other items? I mean, on and on. We learned. It took us actually a couple months to actually proceed so we could get to the place where we have a process in place where we can put a person in to fill parts requests and bring them from the warehouse to production without having production workers go back and forth, and so on. And then, we refined that process further. It ended up we ended up with electronic forms, phones on people's belts. We had taped out locations on the floors. I mean, on and on we went. So here's some guidance around the 3 basic questions that I'd like to provide. This is an example from the previous academy. Rocky Mayal provided these responses to his 3 basic questions. We're going to go through these in a little bit more detail, but if you look at, he says to his answer to question number 1, what he wants to accomplish is receive, inspect, and update Salesforce, which is their system, their computer system, at the same time, and same day approval for additional repairs. So that's an approval process between them and their customer. So one of the things we're looking for when we're asking to answer question number 1, what are you trying to accomplish, is it's solely a description of what you want to reach as a future, with the future as a possibility. It briefly describes the accomplishment, state of affairs, condition, situation, or circumstance that's being sought. It does not include a method or phrases that contain how to, such as by, to, or when. So in the example that I provided, parts are available without travel, parts are available when needed. There's no how to there. It's just, this is what we want to be able to provide at our end state. So Rocky had this: receive, inspect, and update. There's no how to or no method here. It's just, here's the end state that he's looking to accomplish. And then question number 2, if you answer question number 1 clearly, you'll be able to better answer question number 2 with a measure of the so-called destination that you're striving to reach, or a measure of the progress toward that destination. For example, if what I'm trying to accomplish is visit the Navy Pier in Chicago, I would say a change is an improvement. If I'm standing on the pier, so then I've reached my destination. Or if I've traveled at least 1 mile closer to the pier. So if it's 258 miles to the Navy Pier in Chicago from my house, and I measure how far I have left to go, and it's 257 miles, I've made progress. If I measure and it's 259 miles, I've learned I've gone the wrong direction. So I can use either a destination measure or a progress measure as an answer to question number 2. And so we don't want to be vague about this. We don't want to say we'll observe an improved result. What we want to say is something like 5 people will ask questions about this policy change today. Or we don't want to say fewer of this, more of this, or less time. We want to say 48 documents will be processed during the shift. So this is very specific in the question number 2 response that we made in the warehouse situation. And Rocky said this: bulk receipts by box equals 0, and email date same as request date. It's very simple to measure that. I can do that. Anybody else going in can look at that and say, is that happening? Is it not happening? And then question number 3, what possible moves or candidates? This is where you get your ideas for moves to improve. So all your moves to improve answers ought to be in question number 3. And a very useful source is the flow diagram or deployment flow chart. Describe moves that might be tested to see if they make your Q number 1 answer more of a reality. For example, add a new item to the agenda, confirm meeting agreements. That might be an improvement to your meetings. Person number 8 performs steps 2 through 4. So that might be a shift in who's doing what steps on your deployment flowchart. Perform sample taking at the end of each sequence, or follow first in, first out sequencing. So there's a variety of ways that you could say these are moves that we could make. PDSA cycles are not a response to question number 3. PDSA cycles are what you run to answer the questions about the workability or impact of specific moves. So I have a move, now I run my PDSA cycle to test that move idea and see if is that workable. So these are elements answers that Rocky put in for one part of his Q number 1 response. So he listed 7 different responses to part 1 of his objectives. And he also listed 7 different moves he could make to part 2 of his objectives. So if you understand your process thoroughly, you should be able to fill out multiple answers to this. I'm going to ask you to refresh your 3 basic questions. Refine or refocus your answer to question number 1. Use the Q number 2 guidance. So we're going to talk about that briefly here. And list moves you want to test. So we're going to go back into our same groups again. I want you to do a review of off-limits words. So pull up the off-limits words document that I sent you. Use the list on the handout and highlight or note your partner's off-limits words. So you can review those together. You can share them with each other and say, hey, I noticed these words are in your answers to question number 2. So for this exercise, just focus on question number 2 responses in your 3 basic questions. I know we have PDSA form examples here, but just today, focus on your 3 basic question answer number 2. And then you're just going to discuss this. So not necessarily return in exchange for edits, but just have a conversation with each other about this. So questions about what we're going to do in this activity. You need each other's 3 basic questions. So you're going to show those to each other. And you need your off-limits words form. Okay. So I'm going to put you into your groups. You're going to try to identify the off-limits words that exist in each other's forms and see if you can provide better, more concrete responses to that. So I'm going to open up the rooms and we'll have about 8 minutes for this exercise. All right, Ben and Matt, what did you guys notice?
I had more of these off-limits words than he did. But we both had.
So you guys ranking each other? Is that?
Yeah.
That's
because of
good.
the contest, I definitely lost. But we both had the word all. So I think that's a pretty easy one to accidentally use in your question 2 answers.
Yep. Yeah, it's very easy when you first start this. Everybody does some version of using off-limits words, and it takes often half the academy before you start to get answers that are workable in the sense that you can actually give a thorough, complete definition of what it is you want to observe and how you want to track it. So I'm going to ask everybody to look at the off-limits words again, compare the list. Now, remember, this isn't an all-inclusive list. There's all sorts of versions of this. So this is just ideas. But go back and refresh your 3 basic questions and send me new answers to your, especially your question number 2. And then also reconsider how you phrased your predictions in your PDSA. So most predictions show up something like this as well. So I'm going to be in the future addressing anything that looks like an off-limits words in your predictions and your responses to your 3 basic questions. So just have this as part of your approach. Is, I'm going to try to exclude off-limits words from my answers in these areas. Okay. So today, Teach to Learn can cover the concepts of 3 basic questions and project scope, off limits words. Remember, keep adding to your notes about your observations of where you're experiencing or performing activity throughout the system, and add those to notes you'll turn in on Monday. Work on following your plan and then update your 3 basic questions. Our theory of knowledge mind map quotes for today, one's from Sandy Speicher. Learning is the process of using our innate abilities to construct or create new understandings of the world. Learning, by its very nature, is a creative act. And then John F. Kennedy said, leadership and learning are indispensable to each other. This is good work you did today. Thank you very much. Please be in touch if there's any questions you have about any of the assignments that we were working on. And have a good day. Stay warm.
Thank you. You too, Eric.
Thanks,
Thank
Ed.
you.